This is Dan Schneider. This is another of my Biorama interviews with people that I have known in my life in the 20th and 21st centuries. My guest is Don Moss. People who have gone to my website may have seen some of his poems on Cosmoetica. Some people who have read those poems have asked me for Don's email address, and I've actually put him in touch with some young people to read his long poem Dominions, and I will be speaking with him for the next couple of hours. Don Moss is my guest on this Biorama. I have known Don for, if not a quarter of a century, close to it. I met him first in Minnesota in writing groups, poetry scene, the arts scene of that day and time and place. So welcome, Don. As I like to do, I like to give people a little bit of time to just give background about themselves, and then I'll get a bit more specific. So for those people who may not have ever gone to Cosmoetica, I introduced you as a writer and a poet. Um, what can you just tell a little bit about yourself in regards to writing and in general, the arts?
Well, writing began in Minnesota as much as anywhere. I mean, I was an undergrad in college at William and Mary in Virginia, but the kind of writing one does in college, you really want to bury or just forget that you did it. Writing doesn't happen because assignments don't create writing. And the writing started, I suppose, before I met you, in that I was working at least part-time and eventually full-time at the university and just meeting some people who were interested in various arts, and writing in particular. And I'm trying to think of how it is that we first met. Was it prior to the poetry group, or did I just simply attend that once?
I think it might have been, what was it called, Ophelia's Pale Lily Group, perhaps? Or maybe it was at a reading. I honestly don't know. I think it had to have been at least 93, perhaps 92, but at least 93, because I know I had started going more actively in 93 to readings and stuff. So it's probably somewhere around there, although particularly I can't remember.
Yeah, well, somehow we bumped into each other and those things began, because as I was writing, I mean, writing is frequently brought on by what's going on in your life. I mean, not as a release from it, but just the best way to express what's going on. And it was, that was, first marriage, and it had gone a good number of years, and there were, some tensions there, and I think, it related to that a little bit, but it wasn't, I don't think my writing that time was just some sort of written therapy. I mean, did it strike you that way at all? Because I really wasn't.
No, I mean, one of the things I know that first struck me about your writing in general was that it wasn't back, especially in the 90s, was when I guess a lot of identity art, identity writing, I am woman, hear me roar kind of writing was big. And the poems that I first saw from you were, it might have been a parts of Dominions or some other stuff, but it was generally a situation. And James Merrill, you've talked about his writing before, and John Ashbery. It was more along those lines, although I think that the best stuff that you did is better than anything I saw from Merrill, at least.
Well, yeah, Merrill was my discovery of a formalist who could, so comfortable doing that. He was both a modern poet and a formalist. And I don't read him much now.
Yeah.
When I sort of revisit Merrill now, it's pretty selective.
Mm-hmm.
It's some of the things that are a bit freer, and certainly a little less formal. In fact, my now 13 years here, and in general the better part of 2 decades since we were living in the same city. For those of interest, Dan, you moved to Texas something like the year before I moved to Savannah, Georgia.
Yeah.
We both went south about nearly the same time. And I got away from writing a while. I think in part because I got here and I started reading formalists, and it kind of ran me away from it. It just didn't hook me at all. One of the things, though, that I did do for half the years was I got involved in that group called Toastmasters International, which is to say every week you have to give a speech, in effect, or evaluate speeches. And this got me more interested in the spoken word, and it certainly got me more interested in how that's awfully forgotten by a lot of writers. You really got to write things that sound good when said aloud, as well as something that jumps rope with whatever sort of formal rule pattern you're trying to follow. One of the summit forms or any of the torturous to English French forms. So when I came back to writing a little bit, and I'll show you some things, it's not much, but I'll show you some things since then. It's a little freer. And there are some people who, I run into that aren't really even known as poets, whose writing I've been impressed by.
Such as?
Such as our translator, his name is Philip Sherrard, Sherard. He, among other things, translated the Philokalia, which is the classic sort of church forms of the Eastern Church. It's in pages. It is sort of the standard almost of Eastern mysticism, is what they had to do. But the point is, he was extremely skilled as a translator from Byzantine to everything up through modern Greek. He's also translated all major 20th century Greek poets. So if you look in your bookcase, you'll probably see his name as translator of a number of them. So, I just sort of tripped on him, and he's not even known as a poet, but have been very impressed with what he did because he has such care with language.
You said you mentioned Toastmasters, and I know for a number of years you were involved with that. What drew you into that? You said the spoken word, but was it a place to just meet different people as well? It sounds like you've drifted away from that recently.
Well, I sort of burnt out on it because it is a study. Every club meeting is a formal exercise in a meeting. You have an introduction with them. You have a prayer. You have all of the little things that have ever really been associated with a meeting, a formal meeting, and you learn how that operates. Interestingly, the Toastmaster groups, and there's more than there's 2 or 3 of them in the Savannah area alone. But we became the venue for all of the colleges and their public speaking classes. There's SCAD, Savannah College of Art and Design, which is the biggie here for the arts. And there's Armstrong State University. There's the predominantly black college, Savannah State. And then there's a couple of other small things. And they all send students to Toastmasters to give their required speeches, because in the class setting alone, with a classroom full of students, you hardly ever get to speak. And coming to us, you can speak, whenever you need to. So that was rather interesting. And just hearing people stumbling through the English language in every imaginable way is very informative.
Yeah.
Not only in how to read aloud anything, read a recipe aloud, read a poem aloud, read a passage from an essay or a novel. It has you focus on the words in a way that you just don't sitting trying to put them down on a page.
I know sometimes when I listen to these interviews, I and a lot, like a lot of people do, and just like then. But to me, when I listen to language for language's sake, even outside of poetry, there's always got to be an artifice if it's art. For example, if you read O'Neill or you read Ibsen or whatnot, you may get the sense in the moment that the characters are acting realistically or speaking realistically, but you have to foreshorten things. I know when I do dialogue, for example, with characters, if I'm writing a novel or a short story or whatnot, one of the things I always find interesting is that sometimes you have to have the characters, if they're speaking about point A, they may be wandering around the circle and not really realize what they're talking about. You might have a father and son at a baseball game talking about Willie Mays or some other great baseball player, but they're really talking about something different that in real life, these people, your average person may stumble upon some moment of brilliance, but then they don't realize it and the moment passes. Whereas an artist, you realize, they stumbled onto it, I've got to use that. So when you talk about the spoken word, do you look for things like that, those little aha moments that give you an into someone's character?
Well, you certainly do. And what my wife and I have been doing for income, our little home business, is working with people doing qualitative studies. And we're in our, good grief, 17th, 18th year of doing this. And this ranges from boring verbatim interviews that we mostly get women who type boys to do, those do the doctor lawyer sort of thing. And then we will occasionally have really in-depth people who are doing sort of social science things. And again, hearing people more often than not stumbling to try to put a thought together. And then occasionally having the experience of hearing someone who has a mind that runs exactly the speed of words. Not very many people do it. I mean, to put it in perspective, I've had transcribed, believe it or not, a Bill Clinton speech once for the Humphrey Institute at the U of M, and he stumbles all over the place. If you had to actually turn it into, I'll put this in perspective, our motto on our business card says the spoken word into prose. And that's the jump that I'm talking about. Now, prose, granted, is not poetry, and you don't edit these things so that they flow as verse can, but rather, nonetheless, you cut out all of the little filler. And we all have, according to where we grew up and our generation, filler words and phrases that are unique to our particular group and time. And this work that Mark and I have been doing, do you ever get a study of that every single week? I mean, it's amazing.
Well, let's go back to the beginning, though, since we preambled here with a little bit about current doings. I know you mentioned that you're down in Georgia and you were born in the South before you moved to the Midwest. Tell me a little bit about the background of your family. I think you're originally from Virginia. Were your family, there for 100, 200 years back antebellum?
Yeah, they go back. And for instance, on Ancestry.com, I tried to follow that back.
Oh, is that the one where you send in DNA samples? Have you sent in DNA samples?
Well, that will give you that general DNA mapping, but that's very general.
Okay.
I mean, that's beyond whatever that notion of sixth cousin, fifth cousin, and you're that relation to everyone. That's about as far as DNA takes you. There are samplings that you can do with DNA that supposedly will track nationalities and not simply geographical regions. For instance, my last name is Moss, very British name. My mother's maiden name is Quisenberry, also a very British name. I always think that if DNA, if ever anybody was basically a Brit, I would be. Yeah. So the DNA test shows that I'm something like, I don't know, 74% Western Europe. No, not quite that much. Maybe 50-some% Western Europe. A big piece of what remains of the 100%. Eastern Europe. 13% British, or anything to do with the British. So, in that regard, big surprise. But it also has, making a little comment about DNA doesn't show you much. Because those people from Western Europe and Eastern Europe perhaps went to England a long time ago. Yeah. And for all the world, I'm much more British than I am Eastern or Western Europe. I mean, there's all that kind of mess.
The Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, all of those, they all intermingled. By the way, the name Quisenberry, the only person I've ever known with that surname was a former baseball player for the Kansas City Royals, a pitcher. Do you know if you were any relation to him?
Don't know at all.
Okay.
In fact, one other element in the percents that was also higher than the British percent was Scandinavian. Yeah. So I'm trying to get someone from, I know that doesn't come from the Moss side. So I've been trying to get someone from the Quisenberry side to do that DNA test to see, if more Scandinavian shows up there. Yeah. So, it's just an interesting little sideline. I recommend it. I recommend it because you just, it's just a fascinating little thing that you may or may not ever be able to track down in terms of names and actual families.
Well, in terms of actually American habitation, do you know if your family goes back to colonial days then in Virginia?
From everything I've been able to track, yes, they came to Yorktown quite early on, and for the most part stayed in the general coastal, or at least eastern part of Virginia. And the majority of them seem to. In fact, a good number of them came to what is Hanover County, the county just west of Richmond. And it was a very big county, and it eventually was divided into two counties. The one piece of it that took on another name is Louisa County, and that's where I'm from, which is the western part of what had been the extreme west part of Hanover County. So where I grew up was very rural. There was no town. I mean, if you, for instance, think, it must be like country music and talking about small towns. A small town to me growing up was a city. I grew up on a farm. And the nearest neighbor, I could see a little of the roof of their houses in the winter when leaves were off the trees. Otherwise, I was like a half a mile from the paved road coming back into our farmland alone.
When we think of Virginia now, probably most people our age would think of the TV show The Waltons. Was your family, was it up in the mountainous areas, or was it flat land, marshy?
It's the middle part of the state. Okay. If you think of Richmond being relatively flat, and Charlottesville being at the foothills of the mountains, I was about in between the two. Okay. And they're about 70 miles apart. So I was 35, 40 miles from either.
Okay.
35, 40 miles from the city that was burnt to the ground during the Civil War, and then about that distance from Thomas Jefferson and Monticello in Charlottesville.
Well, do you know if anyone in your family were slaveholders, or were they generally working people themselves, farmers? Did they serve in the Civil War on the Union or the Confederate side? Do you know anything about your great-great-uncle or something?
From what I've been able to follow, they were definitely Confederates, not Union. There's one name that other people in my family who've done more research than I have debate. There was a Nelson Moss, and he seems to have had slaves. But there's real argument of whether or not he was actually, related or not. Yeah. Because there's a sort of a skip in the records in there, so it's just not really clear.
Yeah, I know. I'm adopted, and when I found my natural family, I remember when I found my natural aunt. My birth mother's sister. She had done a genealogy, and I remember she had this family tree, and it would go off. They'd have these names, and I had one uncle. They were originally from Minnesota, and I had one uncle somewhere in Wisconsin, and my aunt went, "Oh, that was Uncle Ole. After that incident with the axe, we don't consider him family anymore." So, are there any dark skeletons like my Uncle Ole?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of that war and Lincoln, etc., my toy when I was growing up was a Civil War pistol. Named, 44, it was black powder with a percussion cap. And it was literally my toy growing up. Now, that particular one was a real Colt. And that means it was a Union gun. But that doesn't say a thing about what side my more distant relatives were. I got to put it in perspective. See, my mother's father was born 2 years after the end of the war. He was born in 1867. So you don't have to go back too many greats there to be, really a revolutionary time practically rather than Civil War time. So it's interesting how that follows that. I mean, I have a grandfather who was actually too old to serve in World War I. Yeah. So
it's interesting. I read somewhere online that I think one of the presidents from the 1840s, maybe it was Benjamin Franklin Pierce or Millard Fillmore, or maybe it was William Henry Harrison or Tyler or something, that he actually has grandsons that are still alive because he after the office married a teenager when he was like 70 in the 1850s. She then gave birth to someone who then had, when he was 70, someone. So there are people alive who are just 2 generations removed from, Andy Jackson.
Oh yeah, it's really quite amazing, particularly with the young life. I mean, the usual notions completely fall apart, as they sort of do with what's going on in politics right now. But among other times. But
let me ask then about your direct ancestors, your mother and father. Was your mother's side was the Quisenberries, I would assume then, right?
Correct. Yes.
So. Were they both native Virginians, or did your mother come down from, the Quaker country in Pennsylvania or something?
No, they were both Virginia.
Okay.
Both Virginia, and my grandfather, Quisenberry, James Quisenberry, he was about at least the second, if not third generation that, for sure in the county, a different part of the county, but he eventually acquired the property that I grew up on, and built a house there and so on. He was the first actually county agent for the county. The state sent him off to Iowa, to Ames, Iowa, to egg school, to for further education.
How about your mother and father? What did they do for a living? Were either of them creative in any way?
She was a school teacher. She went to what was then Madison State Teachers College. It was a women's college only then. It's been co-ed for a long time now in Harrisonburg, Virginia, and taught school. And my father, construction, I guess would be the simplest single word, but he owned and operated a couple of bulldozers, is basically what it was, and was not really a redneck because his big love in life was playing golf. So you don't really associate golf, particularly competitive golf on an amateur level, with rednecks too much. So that's about my only claim of separating him from that. But that's what he did.
Do you have any siblings, and what was it like growing up then in a household either as an only child or one of many?
Well, I mean, it was a peculiar setting because my father was always a couple of counties away working, building, I don't know, creating ponds, knocking down forests. I mean, the kind of things that you do with a bulldozer. And it was rather interesting. The area that he worked, Cumberland County in particular, had a number of Dr. Boyer farms. So there were sort of hobbyist farmers who had money to sort of reshape the farm and that sort of thing. And he did that for a great while. He wound up, playing golf with them and all of that. And consequently, he wasn't a farmer. And I mentioned my grandfather's age, that when I was just a young child, he was 70-some years old, so he was more or less retired from the kind of physical labor of real farming. So I largely grew up on a farm that was being farmed by neighbors. They would say, okay, I'll pay you so much to use this 40 acres. And yeah, there were 40 and 80 acres because the farm was about 450 acres. And consequently, I grew up not really associating my future with living on a farm. I was focused very much on things north because I had a couple of relatives that were from various places, including Long Island, for that matter. But I was always going to cities, and it was rather appropriate. The high school I went to until recently, fairly recent years, all the sports teams were the Rebels. Little notion of that ugly war the North started, but consequently, a lot of boys felt rather rebel-like in that setting. I mean, it's quite true. And my sort of mentor in that whole world, including adolescence, was an older cousin, 5 years older, who lived in the town of Louisville, about 15 miles west. And yeah, he was the same way. He was not really connected with the rural scene that he was growing up in.
So just to be clear, you are an only child then?
Yeah, I'm an only child.
Okay.
That makes a difference too.
Okay.
So, I'm growing up on a large farm that is basically being run as neighbors wanted to do things there. I mean, I know what it's like to get up in the middle of the night and go out on the paved road and bring the cattle who had just broken down the fence because of lightning or something back into the field and securing them. And, any number of things like that. I mean, I was driving a tractor when I was, I don't know, under 10 years old. For that matter, driving a car when I was under 10 years old. So I was a farm kid to that extent. But, I mean, that just simply is the basis for a strong sense of independence, as well as just feeling like you're a country kid. The independence was the bigger part for me, I think. So
before we did this interview, it said that in another little over a month you're going to hit 70. So you were born in 1947, and from what you described, did you have a television in your home early, or when did you grow up watching Howdy Doody or something, or going to the movies on the weekends?
Well, there was no indoor theater in the county.
No.
There were two drive-in theaters, one on the western side of the town of Louisville and one on the eastern side. The town of Louisville was about 15 miles west. And I think when I was a really young child, for a brief while, they did have an indoor theater. But to go to an indoor movie, that was going to Richmond. That was going 40 miles east. And, consequently, the movie at drive-in movies, I don't know if you've gone to a lot of drive-in, but back in the 50s and early 60s, they didn't exactly show the current movie, I'll put it that way. You saw a lot of old Broadway and a lot of old things, that were made shortly after World War II and before. And that's about what they had.
How about reading wise? Were you someone who was a reader? Did you hang out or did your town even have a public library? Did you have a Carnegie library?
Just the school library. I don't even remember if there was at that time any kind of little community library in the town of Louisa. There certainly wasn't in Mineral, the closer town. I was not a reader at all. If the chance to go somewhere was one option and sitting and reading, among other things, homework was the other, I would go. Mm-hmm. I really didn't start reading until I was in the Navy and wasn't a bar guy and a drinker, so I really needed something to do, so that's when I began reading. Mm-hmm. So, compared to I don't know, a precocious kid, one I'm speaking with right now, for instance, I wouldn't even qualify semi-literate when I graduated from high school for what I had read.
Let me ask about your growing up in religion, because I know when I first met you in the early 90s, you seemed to me to be sort of agnostic or atheist, and now I know in the last 15 or so years, I don't know if you consider yourself a born-again Christian. What kind of religion were you raised in? Were you a Methodist, a Baptist, an Anabaptist?
Yeah, I grew up in South Anabaptist Church, which was, I would assume, it was officially then associated with the Southern Baptists, but it was not as restrictive as some of the Baptist churches. If you say the word Baptist very often, you think, I don't know, Billy Graham or something, or Eva. If you don't know much about Protestant culture, you assume it's all of one piece, and it's not at all. There are right now somewhere between 40 and 45,000 different Protestant denominations, because ever since Martin Luther and the whole idea of the scriptura, that is by the text alone, i.e. the Bible alone. You pick up a Bible and you say, okay, I don't agree with what so-and-so says. I don't agree with the Catholics. I don't agree with whatever group. I'm going to start my own. So you start your own and you become, tax exempt and so on and so on. So back then, there were not as many divisions among the Baptists as there are now. But there were some that, for instance, would not allow any dancing. And consequently, in high school, you had to, learn if you wanted to date someone. If this was someone whose family attended one of those churches that didn't permit dancing. So life was like that. So I grew up in sort of in-between level of strict church, a Baptist church. And my grandfather, my mother's father, was a senior deacon. So I did sort of have that background. But I also had the experience of being around an individual who was the real thing. This is nothing. You would have to work pretty hard to call him a hypocrite in any kind of way, particularly in what he believed, that is, according to the King James, and his way of operating in the world. He was a very honest, natured, real Christian man, and that, I think, more than just about any individual, is what made me at most, after 4 years of undergraduate analytic philosophies, but that's about as close as I could come to this thing called agnostic, and which is to say, on the principles set out by, I don't know, an H.A. Ayer, say, and the positivists, the logical positivists, who want, of course, to pretend that reason will somehow rid the universe of this thing called religion or anything else that can't be measured according to their notion of the measurable. But in any event, the point is that residue is there. And even in Minnesota, I was drawn to sort of finding what was there that in part I barely learned growing up in a church, just as a child. And what I found was this fractured world of the Protestant universe. And if you grow up in a place where I did, out in the middle of nowhere, I don't think at that time there was even a Catholic church in the county. So the point is, the little bit that I knew about Christianity was entirely little bits of Protestantism, specifically Methodist and Baptist. Heck, I didn't even know anything about Presbyterian.
How about politically? Because you mentioned about the isolation, not even knowing Roman Catholics. Obviously, you probably would have encountered black people back then. It would have been segregation, or was it an all-white community? And was your family sort of like Southern Dixie Democrats at that time?
Other than I recall that my father was enthusiastic for Kennedy and voted for him. I think he even bought. There were albums of Kennedy's speeches. I mean, the promotion of Kennedy that eventually created this mythological thing that people will talk about Kennedy. I don't know if the Democrats do now, but a lot of people still will talk about the Kennedy era almost as Republicans will talk about the Reagan era. Yeah. I mean, it's rather amazing. You don't look at too many details with either. But that I remember about my father. In terms of Republican or Democrat, no, nothing much comes to mind from that time. I mean, it's amazing because, they just weren't that involved with talking about it or arguing about, does so-and-so, does I don't know, Nixon or someone live up to the standard of Eisenhower or something. I mean, given their generation, given their greatest generation time.
Well, you mentioned about there being no public library and the movie theaters being quite far away. How about music? You would have been just, I guess, around 10, rock and roll would have been taking off. Were you listening to Chuck Berry and Elvis Presley and whatnot? I know in later years you're a jazz enthusiast. What kind of music, if any, pop music especially, caught your attention as a young boy?
Well, music was very mixed then. On radio, a station might be daring enough to play an Elvis tune, but, it might be immediately followed by Perry Como or Louis Armstrong or any number of, things, the genres weren't so hardened and divided as they are now, the way it's all marketed and divvied up, even though there's a lot of crossover stuff. But I don't remember much other than just sort of the happy sort of TV version of Broadway kind of tunes. That comes to mind as much as anything. I didn't care that much for the early rock. My 5-year-old cousin, who I spent a lot of time with, he and I treated each other like brothers. He was really the right age for Elvis. And I always felt I was too young for the Elvis thing. And I always felt that even though I was actually the perfect age for the Beatles, I always felt too old for the Beatles.
Yeah.
I mean, something about being a typical rambunctious teenage boy and hearing someone say, "I want to hold your hand," doesn't do much for me. You know, I have more appreciation now for the music of the Beatles, the incredible magic harmony of Paul and John, and things of that sort. But I know a tiny bit more about music to allow for that appreciation now. But I really didn't start listening to rock until I was in the Navy, and it's a very specific experience. Vietnam's going on, so did they send me to Nam? No, they sent me to Sub Base Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, shore duty for 2 years. And I remember being in Waikiki and just walking down the main street, and some bar had a band, and they were doing a cover of the Cream song "Strange Brew," and that caught my attention. And I started listening to that bit of the late '60s, early '70s. Well, that was really mid '60s to late '60s rock. Very specific. I mean, I liked what Cream was doing. I liked what a couple of others were doing. First album I ever bought in my life was Country Joe and the Fish. Yes, yeah. And on bass, I would play. Feel like I'm fixing to direct. 1, 2, 3. What are you fighting for?
Yeah.
Ask me, I don't give a damn. First stop is Vietnam.
Yeah.
Imagine playing that in a Navy barracks around a bunch of career guys. I did. Okay. That's when I started listening to music.
So you, I guess, did you go to college before the military, or did you go to college after? After.
Yeah,
so
I wouldn't have been even remotely qualified to go before. I really started reading in the Navy.
Okay.
And even when I was in Hawaii, I took some classes at University of Hawaii.
So you would have been, I guess, 18 then. In '65, you would have entered the Navy, and you were, what, 4-year hitch?
In '66, I was actually 19.
So 66 to what, 70?
I was 19. It's what?
66 to 70? How many years were you in the Navy?
It was about three and a half, something like that. The ship was going out for a long tour, and so I got a little bit early. Okay. So the ship, 2 years there, and then I was put on a whole World War II destroyer out of Charleston, South Carolina.
So did you not want a military career, or did you go to the military just so that you could get, go to school or something? Or what prompted you to go into the military, and afterwards, where were you personally in your life and thinking what you were going to do?
Well, put in perspective, if you were male and you weren't in college, you were 1A. This is active draft for now. So I was 1A, and either I was about to be drafted, and incidentally, the Marines were drafting as well as the Army. I know several people who drafted into the Marines. And I really didn't, it wasn't an issue of safety. I don't want to be in the jungle fighting, as a soldier. I can't pretend that I thought that at all then. I just simply was more attracted to the sea and the Navy. So, I joined the Navy, before I got drafted in the Army. Because I would have been. I absolutely would have been drafted.
So, when you were in the Navy, did you ever have any thoughts about, what other ports of call did you see? Were you in Asia? Did you go to Australia, South America?
No, nothing at all.
No.
The destroyer that I went on turned into semi-shore duty again because it was going into total, dry dock overhaul. Its second overhaul, I might add, because it was built around 1944, late war. It was the slightly larger version of the destroyer that they were building at that time, and nonetheless, it was an old thing and needed lots of work. So I was the only machinist aboard. So needless to say, I kept the machinery lieutenant happy by keening the valves and doing all the things that needed to be done. And then we went out on shakedown cruises, and then they were going to go to a med cruise, and that's when my time was around to either be staying longer than the 4 years because they didn't want to be going over there with me and not be coming back if they couldn't hold me the extra time. So really, I saw Hawaii for 2 years, and I saw Charleston, and I saw some Atlantic Ocean in the ship, but not even going over to Europe.
So did you, I guess, assume you took the GI Bill, and when you got home, you were able to get into, where did you go to college?
Started at the University of Richmond, thinking that I was going to be a Greek major, a classical Greek major. And somewhere along the line, I got hooked on, I don't know, I guess Aristotle and Plato, and was just really starting to read the playwrights at the time. So it was more philosophy, literature. And then was becoming more and more interested in philosophy, and just decided that I liked what I could tell of the philosophy department at William and Mary. So I transferred there, and my junior and senior year were there.
Yeah.
So it's rather interesting because I somehow graduated from high school, but in college, I was Dean's List, and I was, I don't know, Phi Beta Kappa and Mary. So I guess I was a pretty earnest student for at least a brief while in my life.
So was it at college at Richmond where you met your first wife?
Actually, yeah, I was in Richmond, and she was just about to finish her undergrad in English at VCU. That was back when VCU had just become VCU and had grown up at the university from just being Richmond Professional Institute, RPI. And yeah, I met her, and again, she was an English major, so learning a little something about this thing called Literature in English. She was editor of the VCU literary magazine.
So as you were studying this in the 4 years, were you working your way through college as well, or were you just on the GI Bill? And what was your first job once you got out of education, being educated?
Well, let's see. The way this worked, yeah, I mean, I was doing various student employment. I was still teaching guitar. Wasn't playing professionally at the time, but I was teaching some, and then various campus jobs. I was at the library some. I trimmed shrubs. Boy, I preferred that. I liked that. I was just out on my own. Yeah. And none of this battery-powered clippers. This is all hand stuff.
Yeah.
And, for a philosophy major, that was great because you could just get out and sort of spin on the things that you're reading. Then I was accepted into a doctoral program at University of Virginia in philosophy, and got up there, and the pull at music was getting stronger, and just found myself, well, it was actually a very practical thing for me. I'm a pretty impractical guy. I actually looked at the market of, okay, what is the marketability in the university setting that is teaching philosophy at that time in this country? And there are umpteen little positions at junior colleges where you probably have to teach intro logic forever, and maybe some little intro to philosophy, and maybe a couple of English classes on the side of how to write clearly or something. And that's what you do for the rest of your life, unless you went to one of the top schools, Harvard, Stanford, Yale, and were published a bit. Then you might have a chance of a tenure track position at a 4-year school. And that's pretty much what the market was like. It was flooded with very capable PhD graduates and postdocs at that time in the mid-70s. And that was in terms of what was going on the college campus in general, but the philosophy departments in particular, the French had not taken over entirely then. You might have known of Foucault, or Rawls, or any of the French writers, but it wasn't sort of the gospel as it has become, and all of people's that are just sort of pale copies of them. Anyway, the point is, the world then in American philosophy was hard-nosed analytic with a lot of, I really want to be a mathematician or preferably physicist philosophers. And I wasn't in that world at all. So I really didn't want to pursue it. So I said to my wife then, if you're interested in grad school, why don't you look into it? Because I'm not interested in this UVA program. And so she got a fellowship in American Studies at Minnesota, the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis, and we moved there. So what was I doing then from my graduation, my undergrad, to that point was teaching music. Teaching music at a couple different, at my home and at a store in Charlottesville, and then moving to the Twin Cities. I continued doing that very quickly, and wasn't long after that we put a band together and did that professionally for, 6 or 8 years. I'd have to think about exactly how many years it was.
What kind of band was it? A jazz band?
Oh, as much as one can do that and actually earn a nickel. I mean, it's got to be with pop. I mean, you've got to be able to do, Credence and whatever. I didn't pretend to sing. I mean, I would sing a couple of little things that were more novelty than anything else, but I'm not a singer. So, we would always use a singer, usually in a trio setting.
So I know that, as far as I know at least, you don't have any children. And as I mentioned, you don't have to speak about anything you don't want to. Because I remember you were I don't know if you were married to Marge, your current wife, when I met you, or you might have gotten married a couple of years later. In the decade or so, say the 1980s, was that when your first marriage broke up?
Actually, not until the early 90s.
Oh, okay.
Because she eventually finished her doctorate. It took a while. And that certainly enters into the tensions about it. I mean, it's like, okay, it's just a pigskin. Get it and get on to teaching. And that went on and on and on, so I can kind of get on with things too. So that was, early 90s. So, that marriage lasted about 20 years.
Oh, okay. And was it a conscious decision to not have children? Because you would have been of that age with the Earth Day and, not overpopulation. People of your generation especially would have been conscious about, not bringing too many people into the world, or was it just happenstance?
No, she simply couldn't conceive.
Oh, okay.
I mean, it's sometimes referred to as sort of the intellectual female birth control, namely endometriosis. Which blocks both fallopian tubes. And I believe we went through infertility clinics and shots and testing and the works, and it just could not happen.
And just on a personal philosophical level, is there any regret? Would you like to have had a son or a daughter, or is it just, that's just the way it worked out? Because I know some people, it's odd to me, because when I was young, I wanted to reproduce, but it just hasn't happened. And now I'm too old. I would never even do that, even if I had the opportunity. Is that something that maybe you regret, or is, that's just the way the cookie crumbled?
Well, I mean, I regret. I mean, it's very easy to, become friends with someone who has children who are, now, they're graduates. They're graduates not only from high school, but college and on in life. And I see that. It's interesting. I think about it more often, seeing young adults who could very well have been my children than I do seeing an infant, because I simply have much more experience around young adults than infants. Yeah. I mean, I don't think I've ever changed diapers. I mean, boys don't do a whole lot of babysitting. Yeah. So.
Well, this first segment, I want to just sort of get it up to the time we met, and then in the next segment we'll talk a little bit more about more current things. But so throughout the 1980s, I guess you said you were doing music in a band. Were you also taking classes or anything? Because I know the first thing that I think anyone who has ever met you or people who have spoken to you, and I'm thinking of a few people on my website's E-list, someone like William Glass, everyone's always struck by how intelligent you are and how well-spoken you are. So were you someone that, because you came from this rural, I don't know if I would say impoverished, but rural background, did you strive to educate yourself about philosophy and stuff in the way some people feel they've got to become something? There's the Eastern notion of being, and the West has to become something, or was it just things that interested you that just sort of piled up circumstantially?
Well, there's certainly little about me that's very systematic or efficient or terribly useful, but curious, strongly curious, and the simple notion of philosophy, love of wisdom, which is vague enough, but my take on that, or at least how it struck me, is just curiosity. That when you get involved in something, to go reasonably deep. To not just bob along on the surface. And that's sort of how it works. And people who I know who were philosophy majors, or philosophers for that matter, that's sort of how it works. Them as people. Now, academics have to pump out papers and do these very explicit things and claim to be great specialists or scholars on some aspect of Nietzsche or whoever it might be. In my case, my interest as an undergrad quickly went to those, called language philosophers, in particular Wittgenstein. I know a little bit more about him than I do Austin, the sort of king of the so-called ordinary language philosophy, where you basically argue according to what the OED says the definition of the word is. So, in other words, those that turned philosophy into sort of the sociology of language. I'm interested in it a little bit more, quite a different angle from that hooks up, I think, and has brought me back around to an interest in religion, because I think that the spiritual is what animates just about any field, however strongly the field itself might deny it.
Well, I know that
we might get to that. We might get to that.
Well, I know sometimes I've done now. I just did my 169th. Tomorrow I'll do my 170th Dan Schneider video interview, and I often speak with academics, theologians, philosophers, thinkers, scientists, physicists, etc. I often do trilogies of shows about a big subject where I have a theologian, philosopher, and a scientist give their takes on things. And one of the things I know that I find sometimes a bit disturbing is I'll speak with an academic and they'll know everything, but they never seem to really go deeper, sort of like you mentioned. And there are times when I'll maybe 20, 30 minutes into an interview will ask a question about some topic that they brought up tangentially, and I'm just like you, I'm just asking for curiosity's sake what their opinion is, and they'll say, "Oh, I never really thought about that," and I sit back and I continue talking, but I'm saying, you're 55 years old. You've been studying this for 35 years and teaching it to young minds, and you've never thought about what seems to me a very fundamental question, whatever it might be. There have been a dozen or more times this has happened, and I'm just constantly taken aback by, I guess, the rote nature. And I've said this to many people. I'm not religious, but I find, at least when I talk to people who do believe in, have a religious belief, whether it's Jew, Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, whatever, that they are not like the moral zombies. That people have, they're sort of like the philosophical zombies. And I find a lot of them, certainly in business and even in academia, these people who just sort of shuffle from job to job, this or that. They want to get this grant to do that, and they've plotted out that it's going to take me 3.5 years to write this book about this minor Scottish philosopher in the 16th century, and you know they just obsess about this thing, but yet they don't really do a whole hell of a lot. The book turns out to be 80 pages long about some Scottish philosopher who had this minor idea, and they don't do anything about it. And then if you sometimes you contact them 10 years after the book has come out, they say, "Oh well, I don't consider myself expert enough to talk about it anymore." And I'm like, "You wrote a fucking book about it. You're not. Who am I going to talk to? Bill the janitor?" So I guess my question is, do you find, and I think I know the answer, you tend to have very little patience with people like that just sort of skim life's surface like a mosquito on water?
Well, I don't. And the interesting thing is, the one thing they can claim often is, encyclopedic knowledge of something. And, of course, I'm the opposite. I'm absolutely the opposite. I'm not encyclopedic at all, unless scraps of paper. What is the Wittgensteinian book called Little, which is little scraps of paper thrown in a box randomly, or just simply as they accumulate. Mm. That's a little bit closer to what my mind, I guess, is good for versus the systematic thinker. But the point is, yes, there are people who just treat academic work much like a craftsman would build a chair or something. They're just good at a particular kind of organizing that is true to two criteria. A, it creates grant rewards, awards, and it is at the level that will get peer review and compliments from their peers, which is to say, the very thing that won them tenure in the first place if they're academic, and the very thing that keeps them published in the better journals. And that's about all there is to it.
Yeah. Well, let's end this segment, and when the second segment, we'll talk a bit more about the early 90s when we met, and maybe the poetry scene and stuff like that. And we'll do that in a moment. I am continuing my conversation with Don Moss in this Biorama interview, people that I've known throughout my life. And we started the interview talking a little bit about when we had met in the early 90s and the poetry scene. Let me just ask then, because we mentioned Merrill, I mentioned a little bit about John Ashbery. When did you first start reading poetry in earnest, and when did you get any kind of a desire to write even just a single poem, much less a series of poems or a book-length poem?
Yeah, the when is really a challenge. I can remember, as an undergraduate, I don't remember if it was an intro to English. I mean, it was really kind of a remedial compared to a real literature course. It was rather remedial. But the readings we did the projects were always right about whatever we read. Obviously, no big surprise there. But one of them was a poem, and I'm trying to think of who it was. And all I did was just a descriptive piece on how I saw the writer manipulating words and perhaps line breaks on an extremely elementary level. I mean, I had no understanding of the craft that would go any depth at all. But the point is, it began making me curious about paying attention to, well, why was that word so effective? And if another word was used, would it have been as effective, and would that effectiveness have taken it somewhere else necessarily? So little things like that started, and I think there are prose passages that have affected me every bit as much as things that were or are overtly poetry. I mean, in other words, with broken lines on the page and a whole bunch of white space. The thing about, for instance, discovering someone like Frank O'Hara. I spent a bit of time on Frank O'Hara. The idea, just the audacity of throwing a bunch of lines together and that's that. I'm done with the thing. Was really outrageous. I mean, it is outrageous, and of course, many people thought and would yell, "Yeah, that's poetry at all." I'm trying to think of some of the assessments that have been made of say, Jack Kerouac. You know, that's not writing; that's just scribbling. But the point is, just becoming increasingly aware of how words can determine what is going to happen and how the meaning is going to work, then noticing it in poems and how this is what it's all about there is what interested me in that, and the fact that I think that poetry and philosophy are more related than poetry, or rather than philosophy and prose. Yeah. I mean, the worst philosophy is the writer that just painfully goes on and on the little points, and the people who just have what they have to say, and if they become studied and officially part of, at least for some period of time, the philosophical canon, then people can worry about spinning this or that notion of what they said. But the point is to go ahead and say it and then call it quits and go on to another. That is what appealed to me about it. Yeah. And I see that happening in a poem in a way that I don't see it happening in most prose.
Yeah, I know. I've always thought similarly that philosophers, you can either break them down into just maybe 10 or 12 epigrams for their career, or you get a lot of this kind of just, well, for example, I recently, 2 or 3 months ago, read Camus' The Stranger for the first time, and I felt like I was watching a bad Jean-Luc Godard film, just reading it, because it was just so sententious, so tendentious, so obvious in what it was trying to do, to show that, oh, this guy is a nihilistic bad guy, and not that Crime and Punishment is a perfect book or whatnot, but as bloated as the Russians could get, at least they would play with some ideas, tease things out, where someone like Camus was just, it just seems so third grade reading The Stranger. But with poetry, I have an idea philosophically who Whitman was, who Wallace Stevens was, who Hart Crane was, who, name a great poet that you've ever read. The manipulation of words becomes the manipulation of ideas. And I've said this to many young people all the time, is that Don't worry about what you have to say. Start playing with the words, and the things will come to you if your mind is geared towards accepting something. And you can always go back to whatever idea initiated the poem that you started, but go with what works.
Yeah, and I mean, it sort of discovers you. I mean, it's a mutual thing, as you know.
Yeah.
It's however planned your project might be. Once it's underway, if it's alive, it's going to be the director.
Yeah.
I mean, it's going to determine where it's going to go, and it's quite capable of saying, "I'm not going anywhere."
Right.
And I mean, that's a really hard thing to accept at times, particularly if there were lines early on that really seemed to have some life to them.
So let me just to get back a little bit biographically. So by the time I met you in the early 90s, I guess you'd said your first marriage was ending. Your current wife, Marge, where did you meet her? For those no one would know, your current wife, Marge, is blind. So did you meet her at school? Were you teaching a music course, somewhere? How did you get together with her?
No, it's actually a writing project. Do you remember the Fresh Air Public Radio that was in Minneapolis?
Yeah, I remember Fresh Air. Yeah.
Okay, all right. She had been involved in that years before, and the guy who more or less did the dramas was offering a class on basically writing for radio, and I saw the listing and I took the class, and Marge was in that class as well. And then sometime after that, this would have been, was it a full year or half a year? Maybe half a year before the upcoming quincentennial of the Columbus discovery. Okay, so that was coming up, and what he wanted to do was call people that he thought were up to it from the class that he taught to join him in writing little skits that would be broadcast on that radio station, as if the voyage, the initial voyage, and eventually landfall of that first big time for Columbus. Anyway, the point is to broadcast it as if it was live news.
Yeah.
The news going on then. So Marge with a friend was writing, we would alternate weeks. It would be once a week that the skit would be done because they would have to produce it, get people to come in and do the voices and so on to make it, for instance, sound like, why do I think fake news comes to mind when I even thinking about this in retrospect. But the point is, you create the whole story and narrative of imagining what life would be like on the ship with Columbus on that first passage. And I wrote one of the weeks by myself. And eventually, the group of us who were doing this, because it ran a number of weeks, preliminary to the start of what, when he first set sail to the time that he made landfall. So it ran a number of times, and eventually we had a little meeting at somebody's house, and I had people over where I was living at the time on 3rd Avenue, and we sort of met then. We sort of met through that. So, yeah, that's how that happened.
And what was Marge at the time going to college? What was what was her background?
She had finished her undergrad and was still involved with Women's Braille Press, which was taking the amount of literature that was put into either Braille or printed so that it would be accessible for blind people was not too big. And this was books in particular written by women. And she ran ran a little organization or office that focused on doing just that. So she'd been doing that for years, and not for a living, really. I mean, she somehow managed to to survive financially, but I mean that wasn't any big income thing at all. So what we do now, I guess, is is much like a regular job as she's ever had.
Well, let me ask about. I talked about the Twin Cities art scene, and I know you didn't go to that many poetry readings, as I recall. You came to my Uptown Poetry Group quite often. Probably, I think we had 200 meetings. You probably came to about 120 of them, and there were other poetry groups before then, and concurred to them. What does your general memory say of the early to mid '90s Twin Cities poetry / art scene, pro or con?
Well, I mean, a big city has a good number of people who are, somewhere in between just kind of counterculture and actually wanting to be an artist. There's a great confusion. Some people think that if they're countercultural enough, somehow they are by definition artists, and boy, are they not. They're just bums. But the ones that never really seem to have a job.
Yeah.
Yeah, we saw plenty of them. But there's a lot of energy, and there is, as you are aware and have quite strongly voiced, there's also some pushy places for those who have connected up with the right organization of funding. We can think of one group in particular there. There are, of course, some well-known characters. We can think of a particular guy who got involved with the men's groups, who was based in Minneapolis, and So there. In other words, there's even within that, I think you and I both had little patience for those who had it pretty easy because they really were part of that clique.
Yeah.
And they were trendy, and they were politically very consciously PC, often in this whatever they did that they could call art. Whether it was the poetry or prose or little acting things, whatever they did. So one of the things that I don't mind saying I've left with the Twin Cities is the amount of sort of political correctness. I mean, it was really a pretty thorough running virus in that city that it seemed to me. Now, in university settings, you have quite a dose of it anywhere. But between public radio and a number of other things, less and less I wanted to go to some of the official activities that were going on, either through the university or through that. What the heck was the writing center that was in St. Paul? Or
the Loft? The Loft?
Yeah, the Loft, yeah. Boy, I lost patience with the Loft pretty quickly.
Yeah. Well, let me talk about your long poem Dominions. I know that when I had started the Uptown Poetry Group, I had gotten kicked out of another poetry group. I won't go into the reasons, but it was the typical political correct silliness. But you had started bringing poems that at first I don't think you said that they were part of some longer project. What spurred you to write the poems / book that became Dominions? Was it just trying to get back to yourself? Was it a desire to write about something? I mean, what was the actual spur to that work?
Well, as pieces accumulated, I mean, I realized that they were in some way driven by the same I guess, challenge to write about it. And as they started accumulating, I realized, there's no real long poem, since, of course, it's pieced together in 14 line units in a, loosely speaking, sonnet structure. But as it accumulated, then eventually it became clear, okay, this is going to have to all fit together somehow. And then that helped determine the scope of it. And in terms of the jumping from then what was going on in the 90s with me to this sort of mythical time of this boy who was, 15 or 16 years old back in the 60s, then that started taking shape eventually. I mean, I can't say that was the project from the outset, but a good deal of the time of producing it was with the idea of putting them together. I mean, that notion finally did occur.
I know around that time too, or maybe a little bit later, I think you had started writing some prose pieces about breakfast, I think it was, and you had interviewed me and did I don't know, maybe 1,500 word piece about me. Did anything ever come of that series of writings?
I played with that a bit, and it's something that I think I will continue on in quite a bit different way than I did then. I've got, I don't know, it seems like back then, and even in high school, one of the things that I would do would be something having to do with restaurants for extra income. I even did it when I was in the Navy. So I had, sort of a food background and curiosity, a little bit of study of sort of the culture of food. I was, interested in that whole phenomenon that occurred, particularly in the 70s onward, of this country finally both creating and realizing that it had something that it could call a cuisine. Because usually, I mean, you just talk to just about any European and talk about American food, the most that can happen in a positive way would be, well, let's see, you've got Mexican food and you've got the Cajun food that basically is a spin and mix of Italian and French and black. And I mean, all of these sorts, in other words, they don't think there's any cuisine here at all. And it's a big piece of culture. And if you are this sort of rebellious kid who always thinks, I don't know, there's somewhere with the rainbow lands that there's this deeper, greater, more interesting place, it's usually Europe. And Europe, among other things, has both culinary and literary and every other imaginable kind of artistic depth to its culture that this country has to sort of either realize or create. So it connected with that. In other words, it wasn't just talking about breakfast and the curiosity of that, and it would go this other direction a bit now.
Well,
when it would continue.
You are the second person that I've interviewed who had come to my Uptown Poetry Group, which ran from like 95 to 03 when I left the Twin Cities. Bruce Ariel was the first. Do you have any memories of that group other than, obviously Bruce and I being there? What was your sense of the people who gathered most of the times you were there versus, say, when you went to the Loft or other writing groups?
Well, what I liked about your group, Uptown group, was that, well, it's longevity. And its longevity isn't just accidental. It's what you were doing. It was the luck of having a mix of people who would keep coming and keep writing and keep evaluating. And that, it didn't spin off into something else. And I think, this is where you kept a hand on the reins to keep it focused on a particular activity that was what whole reason that it existed in the first place. So that's being both complimentary to you, but I mean, it is a good fortune of having people who are willing to do that and actively writing. I mean, did some of the people who came, really want something else? That's no question about it. We had juveniles, we had sort of senior people who were, in other words, everything from people who wanted to be thought sexy in some way to a couple of older people who were, I don't know, nostalgic or something. So I mean, it was quite a mix.
Yeah.
Quite a mix, and just the fact that it kept going that long.
Well, I mentioned, you mentioned earlier that I left in '03. You left in '04, the Twin Cities. I know I left after I had lost a job working for a county court. This was when Jesse Ventura had screwed up a lot of Minnesota financially and stuff. But what prompted your leaving Minnesota? I think Marge, if I'm correct, is originally from Minnesota. Did you have to convince her to move south, or was she sick of the winters, or did she just want something different in her life?
Well, okay, back to the long point, to Dominions for a moment.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of what part and how much reference there is. Oh, yeah, the trip going from D.C. down to Atlanta was what got us to Savannah for the first time.
Yeah.
And it was back when the airlines would allow you to find one airport and on a round trip return, leaving from a different airport. I think you would pay through the nose now to do that, or probably be arrested under suspicion of, I don't know, tourist activity, but then you could actually do it. So we flew into the D.C. area, I guess Dulles, and then rented a car and drove largely through the mountains rather than coastal, all the way down to Atlanta, and eventually got on a plane there and back to the cities. So in so doing, we decided, well, this is rather interesting, so let's take another trip here, because though I'm from the South and very much feel that I'm a Southerner in some very fundamental kind of way, and went to a high school, the teams of which were called the Rebels, nonetheless, I now live 500 miles south of where I grew up.
Mm-hmm.
So indeed, I'm in the Deep South now. And it is a very different place from that sort of border town. I mean, growing up in the Central Virginia area, I know the Mason-Dixon is well above D.C., but you kind of mark the north-south with D.C. You do, growing up in that area.
Yeah. When
I would be visiting a relative in Silver Spring, Maryland, which is just a northern burb of D.C., really, I really felt I was in the north. It was a different world.
Yeah.
And, the times that I got up to New York, then didn't feel wildly different. Even though I know back in the 60s, D.C. was still more a southern city than you could imagine it being now.
Mm.
And now it's just sort of that universal kind of, I don't know what place. But that's how it was then.
Well, you, for about 3 or 4 years, I think Jessica and I watched your cat Mango when you would go for the summers down to Savannah. Did it take a few summers being down there for you to finally decide to make the move as well? Or?
Well, it took a while to go the full step. I mean, the full step would be selling the house in Minneapolis and going. But it's rather interesting. I broke off from the prior story about how it is that we wound up in Savannah. We did then get a one-way flight, not that many months after our drive from D.C. down to Atlanta, we flew into Atlanta, rented a car, then reached Savannah for that first night stay after arriving in Georgia, and woke up the next morning and looked out at the busy street, Abercorn Street. It's the main street of Savannah, the longest business street. But anyway, I looked out, and across the street was a car dealership, and to the left was pawn your type of your car. And I thought, I bet there's more to Savannah than this crap. So we got in the car and started driving up Abercorn north toward downtown area, and just saw a little sign before we got to US 80, and it was an arrow pointing to the right, east, and it just said islands. So we turned east and went until Highway 80 ended, and it ends on Tybee Island. And that's roughly, 18 miles from the city of Savannah. But we stayed there a night or two. And leaving the island, we said, how about here next week? And, just one of those little murky things. We said, okay, let's do it. So we drove on up the coast and eventually turned the car in and rented a van and things in Richmond still that I had to transport back to Minneapolis. So come the next December, we pack up the car, officially rent our house in Minneapolis. So in effect, for 3 months, we were homeless because we, by contract, had given the use of our house to somebody else. So we then drove to Tybee Island and found a place to stay. Tiny little place, so close to the sand dune that literally night and day you could hear the waves coming in. And stayed there until, well into March. Went back. So we did it again and again and again. In fact, we did it 6 winters, increasing the amount of time to where we were staying on Tybee for a full 4 months and then going back. And eventually it became pretty obvious it's great to be away from Minnesota during at least all of winter, namely early December to almost May. So eventually we started looking at houses, and our very last stay over here before we actually moved, we looked all around. There's Marge is behind, and there's no even city bus or any public transportation that goes out to that island. There used to be a train and once upon a time a bus, but it doesn't even go there. The nearest island is 10 miles inland, and that has one bus that will come there twice a day, mainly to pick up people who work in town and to bring them back, and that's about it. So we knew we had to, look in town, so we did, and found where we are now. And that's how it happened. We went back and talked to the people, who basically show you how to sell a house yourself, which we did, and they do the lawyer needed part, and you pay them a very modest amount rather than a big chunk of change that you'd pay a realtor. And moved here, and have not regretted it, even though for her it was a good deal harder than for me, because basically everyone she knew was there. I mean, she traveled a fair amount, knew some people who had one time or another been in the city who were elsewhere then, all over the lower 48. But it was a good deal harder for her than for me. I can make friends a good deal more easily than she can. I mean, just simply by being sighted versus being blind. I mean, it does make quite a difference.
Yeah.
But she's become, quite involved with blind groups here and has organized conferences. And in fact, one of the things that she discovered when we moved here is that this is far enough south that you can grow citrus, you can grow oranges and lemons and grapefruit and limes and all of that. So we now have something like 26 trees, and nearly 12 of them are in the ground and will survive as cold as it gets here. And the others are in pots that we have to protect during the coldest part of the times that it actually gets cold here. So that has connected her with the place as well.
Well, let me just ask about Marge, because when we had the Uptown Poetry Group, probably about 7 or 8 times, maybe we had come over to your home there, and I know Marge. Her last name is Schneider, no relation to me. So Marge always struck me as coming from Minnesota as sort of very liberal. She kept her own surname after marrying. You mentioned that she was involved in some like women's press and whatnot. And I know that, for example, you, as I mentioned earlier, have gotten, at least from my perspective, from when I knew you, more religious and more conservative in your political beliefs. Are you and Marge, are you sort of in sync, or do you sort of balance each other off in terms of, because I think I remember once having a conversation with Marge where I got the idea that she was sort of a Humphrey Democrat from Minnesota, and maybe I'm wrong. So what is her political and religious beliefs? Is she religious herself, or?
Well, she certainly grew up Lutheran with her mother,
Yeah.
Keeping all the kids there. She's one of 4 siblings, but the political change. I don't know really what to describe me. I mean, am I some sort of Reagan conservative? No, I'm not. But in terms of the current situation, and we don't need to get into that in any detail because it's such a distraction. I'm not disappointed of the when it came down to either Hillary or Donald. I really didn't see a choice, but to go with the R rather than the D in this case. That's ambiguous. Republican versus Democrat. Am I a registered Republican or something? No. But could I ever be a registered anything? I don't really think so. March actually has moved a good deal more in the simple language in the conservative direction, but it's those words don't really work anymore. I really don't think they do, because they've got to be so far removed from what the word actually seems to mean. I mean, does it mean that well, what? I mean, the Republicans can't figure out who they are. The Democrats can't figure out if they want to be, full-blown socialists or whatever. I mean, it's just a big mess. So is it as simple as saying I'm an independent? Well, that term too, I think, is pretty useless now, because you can still vote. You're still, I think, for the most part, forced to vote almost down the line, one party or the other, because they're that different. They're really that different. And they really, and I say that with qualifications. I mean, there's rhetoric and then there's action. They're really all similar. In fact, of actions.
Well, it's interesting you bring that. It's interesting you bring that up, because I actually watched a YouTube video of a fellow who was, I forget the guy's name. He's semi-popular YouTube. He maybe gets 10,000 hits per video. My videos on deeper subjects get maybe 500 in a year. But anyway, he did this video back in October before the election, and he was talking about why he thought both Trump and Hillary were bad candidates, an opinion I share. And he took something and he talked about Hillary's positions, and he took right off of Hillary's website, and he out of like maybe 15 positions, 13 of them he took then and compared them with George W. Bush's 2000 campaign, and they were almost worded exactly verbatim, Hillary and George W. And And so whatever you want to say about Trump, pro or con, he's not really with the Republican mainstream. The Republican mainstream and the Democratic mainstream, to me, when we talk about the Clintons as sort of, I would call them Republicans light versus the Bush family, I don't see really a whit's worth of difference between them. And it was brought home starkly when this guy side by side lined up W's and Hillary's. For example, Hillary, we've got to get back in the Middle East. We've got to do this, that, and the other thing. The rhetoric against Putin and whatnot. All of this stuff was just so W. And the guy said he didn't understand why Democrats, if they are supporting Hillary in 2016, why 12 years earlier were they so against W, since it's basically the same platform?
Well, 12 years before, I mean, what he was running against wasn't quite the same as Hillary. I mean, I think, over the last years, the Democrats have really stopped being, I don't know, I can't think of any kind way of putting it. I mean, other than they've just fallen off the left side entirely in this big confused mess. And I don't understand how there could be that much pressure for that little bit of independence. But, I mean, you have someone like McCain coming along now who, what right does he have to call himself a Republican? I don't really understand. Is it because, I don't know, he seems to be advocating war for Russia? I mean, it's such a confused mess, and, it lacks clarity. The outcome of this current election, is a wild surprise to everyone, including both of the candidates. So it's rather interesting. I don't know. It's the case of, sort of, are the masses going to be good for creating something that the parties have entirely either given up or have just simply lost touch with? I don't want this to turn into a political discussion, but I mean, it is rather amazing what is going on right now.
Yeah.
And it's I don't have any patience with, I mean, in terms of this household, both people did vote for Trump because I really, really disliked what Hillary was doing. And with Hillary, you could really look at what failures she had, and she had a truckload of them. So the old game of listen to my words, don't look at what my hands are doing, don't look at what I've done, that simply didn't work this election. So that's part of what's so surprising about this election.
For me, I think the problem is that whole duopoly, because it breeds extremism. It's sort of like being in one of those centrifugal force rides that they had years ago when I was a kid, where you're pinned up against the wall and you're either on the left side or the right side. And I've always thought that if we got elections where you had if you didn't get to 50%, say, you'd have to have a runoff, or if you'd be able to vote, this is my first choice, this is my second choice, this is my third choice. You could force the minority parties, and by minority I mean, mathematical, not by races or religions, but and that way you would force people to have to work together. If you look at like England or most of Europe, you have these coalition governments. If the Christian Democrats, for example, in England are pissed off at the Labour Party, well, they'll go over to the Tories and they'll form a government, or vice versa, and that brings moderation. Because to me, the real problem that I see in the world is extremism, which only works if, let's say, the Nazis are marching into Poland and you're a Polish peasant. Then you can be extreme. But under other circumstances, most extremism to me is just ridiculous. There was just a few days before we recorded this, there was a guy who apparently is Milo something or other, who was kicked off of the Berkeley campus. And here's where the free speech movement was, supposedly created back during the Vietnam War. And so you have left wingers acting very extreme, uh, and they become sort of a parody of the very right wing stuff. And I'm by no means I'm not fond of the very far right either. But as someone a friend of mine once told me, it's like if you claim to be liberal, you should know better, but they don't.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, there's so many mechanisms in place now in terms of who are the professional protesters. Are they actually students? I mean, there are just so many unknowns in there, or kept unknowns, that you can only guess. You can really only guess. But, were there anything like students? When I was an undergrad, were there any students even remotely like these alleged students now? No, there really weren't. I mean, there were a few people who would go and jump on a police car or something, but I don't know. They were so few. And the organization now, I mean, Alinsky comes in here because everyone seems to operate with that model now in politics. It's not just those who wrote an undergraduate paper on, namely Hillary, or taught him and were influenced so strongly by him, namely Obama. But the idea of variations of the end justifies the means, of always being on the attack, of there not being any such thing as negotiation. I mean, that is the mechanism that is now running things. And there's this high level of organization of the sources, and however it may in fact be operating, there are a lot of influences in money flows and health and organization and training and advocacy and things that are going on that are way beyond complaining about, students would do that if they really understood. It's not about understanding. I mean, students, those actual students who are involved in the really radical, destructive stuff, are just swept into it the way young people can be swept into anything that kind of reminds them of sex. I mean, it's that kind of excitement. I mean, I don't see any more claim to knowledge and understanding and genuine protest of what's going on than that. Because I've met enough students to know that it's not there.
Well, let me ask and get back to, I guess we call it faith or religion. Earlier talked a little bit about that. And I mentioned that when we first met, you seemed to be more, I guess, in the atheist or agnostic mold. I know before a couple of days ago, before we did this interview, I talked with you briefly on the telephone, and I was telling you about how I had lost a job a couple of years ago, and I went through some stuff, and so now I'm working at a local school district doing custodial work while I'm looking for something better, and I'm working till midnight now, so when we have our lunch break, it's in the middle of the evening and it's dark out, and I go walking around the edge of the campus out here in the Austin area, where we're north of Austin, so we can see the city lights. We're up on a hill, and I look up and I see, can't see the full Milky Way. I can see more stars than I did growing up in New York, and you see the beauty of the night sky. And when I look up there, I just see something that is, from what I can tell, happenstance. It's beautiful. It touches something in me. When you are out, say, on Tybee Island, which I would assume is far enough away from Savannah that you get a good view of the sky, and you look up and see the night sky, do you see what would, I guess people would say, the handiwork of God, or the craftsman who made, the idea of the clockwork making the, do you see the hand of God when you now look up there? And or do you still have some element of that, well, maybe a deistic view? What is your idea of God, a personal God to you?
Big question. I'm not a deist. No. I don't look at it as clock. My mysticism perhaps doesn't go a lot deeper than the words of one and joy. I mean, if you have any bit of the Christian notion of this thing called God being, this triune God being first and foremost associated with that deeper sense of love, then the experience of it, the basic fundamental experience of it, is not at all mechanistic. You can express that by writing beautiful, flowing, picturesque lines or essays or a number of, or you could do it in painting, or you could do it in dance or whatever. Or since there indeed are profoundly mystical, religious scientists and mathematicians, you can do it through the expressions you use of equations and algorithms and formula. And you can see it in a non-applied, purely abstract notion of mathematics if you are a pure mathematician. I mean, it can come out in all of these ways. So, for instance, this notion that, if you have had this much science, you must then know that this thing claimed to have, omnipotence, omnipresence, all of this could possibly be, because there's just no way at all we can possibly ever know it. Yeah, but I mean, part of the problem here is the westernization of the demand of understanding. And this is a little bit of where this is a big part of where my religious journey has gone, namely, growing up first and foremost Protestant, and a very particular kind of Protestant, but all Protestants, if you think about the originator of where this began with the Reformation, with Martin Luther, there is the freeing from tradition. There's the freeing from the priest. And there's the seeking of all things higher through looking at this Bible thing alone, namely the principle of sola scriptura. And as soon as you start reading church history, you go back before the Reformation, and you don't worry about whether there was some scam going on by a good number of members of the church, of the Roman Catholic Church, to just haul in the dough. I mean, if you want to think of the grand hauling in the dough, think of what happened with the princes saying, yeah, to Martin Luther and raiding the riches of the monasteries and other things. Think of what happened in England. And what a grand looting and whatever, anything in its way getting in the way, and the nun would be great to sleep with, etc. I mean, just the incredibly bad things that followed from that. But before then, before 1054, when there was the Great Schism, the separation supposedly occurred. It's much more complex than that, but it's usually attributed to that time and this notion of, in the Nicene Creed, of the West insisting, a la Charlemagne really, and that the word filioque, which is the Latin word, and the Son, that the Holy Spirit comes from the Father and the Son. Well, traditionally, it was from the Father. Now, let's not get into the theology of the significance of that, but rather get into this divide between the East and West notion of the mystical. The West basically is based on an Augustinian Aquinas in particular. Aquinas picked up Aristotle. And if you think about that famous painting of the Greeks, and in the center is Plato on, I can't remember if Plato's on the left or the right, but his hand is upwards, which is indicating there is the good, the divinity. And Aristotle has his hand down, saying it is here, within. And it's that divide that is the start of the understanding of the difference between the East and Western Church. Oh, let me put this in context. I'm a member of the Greek Orthodox Church here in town, the St. Paul Greek Orthodox Savannah. You can look at it there with this website. And have become, quite taken by this approach to the understanding of the mystical, of how one deals with the kind of experience you were talking about you look up the sky, and without having to force the scientific dogma of the West, right, that, oh no, it's the Big Bang. And the Big Bang physics it had to happen. A bang, and it happened, and it was a mechanical thing, and, blah, blah, blah. So, aside from that, if you look up and just say, wow, this is far beyond my understanding. And it can then hook up with any number of the great religions. It can hook up with Christianity, preferably the Eastern variety, or the most mystical of the Western. It can hook up with Buddhism. It can hook up with Islam. It can hook up with a number of things, with Hinduism. There is a certain shared quality there. Now, seeing this, anyone hearing this who happens to be either very knowledgeable, say, this is what, this is too simplistic, this is, universalism and whatever. There's some wonderful writing that I can recommend on this very theme. Is this Orthodox Eastern, now that I'm of an Eastern church, a member of an Eastern church and attendant, is it fully approved by, the bishops and the metropolitans of these? Yes and no. It really depends on which one you talk to. But and it's part of the beauty of the Eastern Church. There's variety. There isn't one single pope. And, of course, that is the big divide between the East and the West as well. Mm-hmm. This idea of having this one supreme head, mortal head of the hierarchy, who is, in this case, with the West, the head bishop, the bishop of Rome, the pope. There is no pope with the West. And that appealed to me as well, because for lots of reasons I had, long rejected the validity of the claim of this one individual having this little red phone to the deity as the Roman Church very recently claims. But anyway, I've been jabbering for a long time.
Well, it's interesting because a couple of weeks ago, I think I was emailing someone about the ahistoricity of the Byzantine Empire and Constantine, because during its reign, I think it ended in the 1400s, it was just known as simply the Roman Empire. The term Byzantines didn't come till a century or two after it fell, and Constantine and his descendants were, the lineal heads there. Was the Greek Orthodox Church founded during what we call the Byzantine Empire then?
Well, the language was Greek. Yeah. And so the reason that Christianity has gotten so divided is in part because of the attachment to those two biggies, namely Plato and Aristotle, the West to Aristotle, and the East to Plato. Now, a lot of people will scream about me saying that as well, because, the Neoplatonists, that's heresy, blah, 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 blah. Okay, yeah, in some sort of way. But the point is, the general notion is of the East is more connected to the Platonic notion than it is the Aristotelian. So that's really, I think, part of what that person may have been talking about.
Let me ask about. I did a show, actually two shows. I couldn't get the women on at the same time, but last weekend about the near-death experience and whatnot. So you had mentioned that you're just ending your seventh full decade in a month or so. Do you now? Are you a believer in life after death? Then is that part of your religious belief, or do you think that when you take in your last breath, that's it, and I've lived a good, honest, decent life?
Yeah, do I accept? There's, it's. I'm trying to think of which way I want to put it. There was the notion of just simply, do I accept the Christian notion of life after death and heaven and hell and blah blah blah? The quick answer is yes, but the more existential answer is as deep as it goes in terms of what, for lack of any useful word, we'll call the feeling about it. I profoundly feel that this is not it. And it's rather interesting.
Let me just add, when you say this is not it, you mean the reality that we are in right now?
Right. Do I understand that or accept particular notion of what life will be like? Is it going to be this notion of the perfect earth and we're going to be in our bodies still? The Christian notion of this uniquely different, non-created, eternal thing that we call Christ, we call Jesus, the man. It's profoundly interesting, and you would have to read, someone like Lewis, I think, puts it as well as anyone for the Western to start with that. Even though he didn't go east, he certainly had a good understanding of it, and he didn't even go to Rome. He just went to the Church of C.S. Lewis.
Yeah.
But there's something very unique and profoundly interesting about this notion of the God to kind of do the shake that was needed to become man and to die as a man, but to continue. And just that thought alone is, I think, profoundly interesting. And it's then a matter of whether it works on you in a way that becomes this thing we call belief. Because you can talk about it forever, as we're forced to do, because that's the only medium we have to communicate it, really. And someone like Lewis, have you read C.S. Lewis?
I've read some of his essays. Yes, I also read 2 or 3 of the Narnia books when I was young.
Okay. The essays in particular, because I really haven't read the Narnia books. Yeah. The essays in particular, I have limited patience because it is too much of the rational mind, of the Western mind, trying to force a little bit more understanding than I think can happen. Chesterton, I think, comes a little bit closer through his irony, perhaps, in communicating some of it. But again, it's pretty Western the way he's doing it. But this whole notion of talking about life after death, I don't really see it as that radical a thing. If there is this part of us that knows this thing, okay, big difference between the East and the West. In the West, we talk about the natural world versus the supernatural.
Yeah.
And just the fact that both of those words contain the word natural is sort of intuitively confusing. It makes them too similar. The East, by contrast, talks about the created versus creator. Everything that we experience, that science can measure, even the things we look up in the sky and cause us to wonder, are created things. So when you're talking about this other sphere, this other dimension, even that, that word doesn't work. It's just simply that which created and itself was not created. That is the way the Eastern Church looks at it. And it doesn't ever use the notion of natural and supernatural. If you can just sort of bracket that, I know we can't banish it, so let me use a good modern post-mod way of talking about it. If you can just bracket those terms and let your imagination spin on this notion of the created world, this body, this camera, everything that I see and hear, you got a bird there, or is this, what is the squawking? What is the squawking that I'm, you're laughing.
Oh! You're asking me. Are you looking off camera? No, I'm not. No, I thought you were talking to Marge.
Looking at you on camera. I'm sorry.
No.
Yes. Oh, okay. Do you have some sort of exotic bird there?
No, it maybe this is my chair squeaking.
Okay, good. You have an exotic chair. Okay. I've been hearing it as a bird.
Oh, okay.
Interesting. Okay. So even WD-40, which your chair can use, is a created thing.
Yeah.
And consequently, there is this other dimension that, fine, there's the Big Bang. And this was, the East could say, okay, this is the beginning, we'll say, of this thing we call creation. But it wasn't some quirk of physics that just had to happen in this wildly explicit way. But it was actually the command by this thing, and thing is a useless word there, but by this authority, power, whatever, that itself was eternal and is eternal. I mean, think of the passage when Jesus is confronting the Pharisees, and he says they were talking about, well, we're followers of Abraham and so on, and Jesus' profound reply is, before Abraham, I am. So he equates himself with this very thing that usually you associate only with the Father. So, I mean, these little things are ways of giving some hint of the Eastern versus the Western imagination within Christianity.
Yeah, when you were talking about the words there, I was thinking of how I've argued with some people who talk about natural and artificial, and I say, what you're really saying is man-made versus non-man-made, because anything made by man is going to be natural, since we're natural. I mean, but let me ask this though, because it's interesting, because I didn't know, for example, about you're in the Eastern Church now, and you talked about a bit more about mysticism than I would have expected. I know that I have very little tolerance for a lot of what I would call New Age stuff. This Dr. Phil, Oprah Winfrey, Deepak Chopra kind of stuff. But it would seem to me that you seem to be all right with the sort of, I guess, picking and choosing. I mean, the term, for example, personal God, is not one that I remember growing up as a kid. I was raised in a Lutheran church, the Missouri Synod, and I remember, there was God, and, the Catholics believed this, and the Anabaptists that, but this is the way God is. You should live a good life, blah, blah. There was a TV show called Davy and Goliath, little cartoon clay characters that I remember as a child. But it seems to me that even over the course of my lifetime, which is almost 2 decades less than yours, that the idea of say, what's wrong?
Go ahead. I'm just trying to get this a little bit better, so I'm looking. I can see you a little bit more.
Okay. It seems to me that in just my lifetime, there's a sort of supermarket of spirituality that's become that. If you want to go to the produce, or you want to go to the sliced meats, or you want to go to the health food section, that people are picking and choosing their own kind of spirituality. As someone now who is Christian, but who is not, at least here in America, would be mainstream, because the Eastern Orthodox is not the Roman Catholic Church. It's not any of the big Protestant religions. What are your views on other people and their belief systems? Are you someone who thinks that Jews or Muslims or Mormons aren't going to heaven then, or?
The membership in a church, East, West, pagan, whatever, it really doesn't matter with most people. I mean, Jesus was onto something when he talked about the road is rather narrow, and this is its own long discussion of influences and arguments and indeed readings of in particular, say the book on in the Bible, among other things, and we certainly can't get into that. But the point is, there are really few believers that you share a pew with very often. I mean, they are there for friendship. They're there for things that are not bad, but it's not a mystical understanding of these greater things, and the notion with a lot of people, for instance, there's the term cafeteria Catholics in particular. Catholics, Catholicism right now is really incredibly divided since Vatican II. I mean, Vatican II was almost like its second Reformation, to tell you the truth, because it got away from its rather universal use of Latin Mass and things that would give a sense of unity that you can't have when some priest thinks that he can, stand up there cross-dressing the banjo and do Mass. I mean, it's a travesty, and it would be viewed a travesty by a Mormon, by a Buddhist, by any, I think. And so when you're getting to this other, the cafeteria approach, I think, is just utter nonsense. I mean, I don't own a TV. I have never watched an Oprah show. I have no idea what TV shows are on. I couldn't tell you what TV shows have been on since Hill Street Blues or something like that. That's probably when I last watched TV.
Yeah.
I mean, the original Hill Street Blues. I don't know if they've been reruns or not. So that's how far I've been glued from pop culture and this sort of cafeteria approach to spirituality. The whole notion that one can be spiritual but not be of a religion is utter nonsense to me, because the work that's been done in any number of not denominations but of religions is far deeper than someone's choosing to get interested in, this hip church over here, or this giant Baptist church, with as an example, Calvary Baptist in town here has an orchestra pit. You go to a sermon or go to a service there, and you really think you're going to a Broadway show.
Yeah.
It's slick, that well done, and requiring that kind of financing.
Yeah.
So
I know.
I have patience with that kind of church. I don't have any interest. I'd much rather be in a cave by myself than that.
Yeah, there's here in Texas every Sunday morning, and we're recording this on a Saturday. There's 4 or 5 shows that are broadcast, and there's a guy who's built like a $200 million cathedral somewhere here in Texas. I don't know where, maybe near Houston, and he'll broadcast all over the state, and I mean he goes throughout most of the South, and I'm sure through maybe even into Canada. There is a kind of like you said, a Broadway quality to it. You almost think Nathan Detroit is going to come out at the next curtain call.
Exactly. No, it's like that. And a lot of those churches crash as soon as the people. I mean, let's take the classic Billy Graham example, the big tent revival.
Yeah.
Billy is very, very charismatic and really does get to people. But I mean, is this then coming to this point? Another divide within even Protestants, but still very common among Protestants and dominant with, say, Baptists. You can tell me if this is true of Lutherans or not. But this notion of once saved, always saved.
Yeah.
If I accept Jesus as my personal Savior, then it doesn't really matter if I am the next Charlie Manson.
Yeah.
And go out in flames. I'm saved, and I'm going to go to the same heaven as so and so. I mean, that kind of notion.
Yeah.
Utter nonsense. I mean, utter nonsense. I mean, if that were salvation and all there is to it, then maybe I don't want it. Because it doesn't make any sense to me. It doesn't command you at all, your life.
Yeah. Well, let's end this segment. In the final segment, I'll give you some closing remarks, and we'll do that in a moment. I've spent a couple of hours plus talking with Don Moss about his own life and whatnot. I want to just end with a few questions, and then that I've asked some of the other people. But specific to you, since a lot of people, especially younger people these days, equate art with some kind of spirituality. Do you do that as well? Because I've always said I feel that art, in a sense, translates the cosmos. If you read a great book, if you view a great film or a great painting, you get to know something a bit more essential about this thing that is. Do you have spiritual leanings when it comes towards art and its experience?
Well, art that moves me, incidentally, what you contrast, I don't see that being totally separate from a more mystical view. It's just an issue of emphasis. There is something going on in successful art that is always beyond the thing itself. A painting that just simply isn't understood by the most careful analysis of either the images or, on the more technical side, its brush strokes and coloration. Likewise with a poem. Those words come alive and say something beyond any other way of saying it that points to, I think, without getting mystical in the corny sense, that always points to something greater. Now, the subject can, I suppose, focus on it, but I mean, what do you do with a Flannery O'Connor who can have absurd characters? Now, granted, a novelist and prose writer, but nonetheless, who can have absurd characters doing, very ungodly things, and yet she was profoundly religious practicing Catholic who believed that the Mass, of the accepting daily this bread and wine that she truly believed was the body and blood of the Savior. And she saw art through that lens. See, there isn't really a conflict there. It's, if anything, on the most positive way of contrasting it, I think they both reduce to, on the one level, something more than on the surface you could ever guess was there. Now, is it simply an issue of one's own private personal experience? Then we're back to kind of cafeteria mysticism. Or is there something that goes beyond that, that is something greater, and in some sense is shared by a variety of people? And there's just something that is more like this personal understanding or experience, is more like the personal understanding or experience that someone else has. And things, I think, traditionally of the canon, for various reasons, were thought of that way. Sometimes for the wrong reason. Sometimes, obviously we know about the critique of the Western canon and, particularly what the critical theorists have done to it. But there is this core universal, to use the word that I just used a moment ago when we're off air, the perennialism of it. Sort of metaphysics that is beyond anything you can easily describe.
Yeah.
That's a lot of blather, but that's what I'm saying. I don't see a wild difference in the two.
Yeah, it's interesting. When you were saying that, it brought to mind a poem that I remember I brought probably in the late 90s to the Uptown Poetry Group, called Poetry Itself, and the opening lines is there is the feeling beside that which is felt, as if a great artwork beyond consciousness, whether gazing a church tower or being sifted through its panes like alluvial photons. And the way you phrased talking about not seeing a great difference, it just brought back to mind my own words there. Let me just ask about then your own writing. You'd mentioned earlier that you may start doing that again. Do you have any ideas of maybe doing another long poem, or writing poetry, or writing prose?
Well, I've been impressed by a couple of writers who, one is more formal, and actually with Schoen, for instance, I'm reading, partly he did the translation as well, but it was originally written in German. So, again, the perhaps rather strong shadow, at least of the original. With Sherard, he writes his in English, so I at least can go at what was originally the idea. And the point is, Sherard has shown me, I think, a little bit more possibilities to, what is called prose poetry, or at least something that looks a little bit more prose-like on the page, even though there's some conscious notion of what word is last in a line. So what I find myself, sort of scratching notes on is a little bit closer to that than something that I'm worried about X number of beats in a line and syllables and so on.
One of the things I've asked people, and one of the reasons I'm doing these interviews with people that I've known at various points in my life, is that perhaps someone 50, 100, several hundred years from now, when we've got space stations around Jupiter, or maybe going to the next star, could look back and say, oh, it's interesting that people back then in the wayward, the backwards 20th and 21st centuries even had these thoughts. I've always thought that, and for example, I'm writing a book now, a science fiction book, which is the third book of a genre trilogy. I did a Western and then a spy book and then now a science fiction book set 1,500 years in the future, is that there are commonalities between all human beings. And let's say if this technology existed, X amount of centuries ago, one might be profoundly interested in the Napoleons and the Genghis Khans, but equally interesting would be the little people that was the public servants of the Chinese emperors or whatnot. Do you what would you say, let's say, if you could speak directly to someone, a century or two from now, looking back on this, about, I guess, common humanity? I mean, you've spoken about your belief systems, politically and religiously, but is there anything, I guess, more fundamentally human even that you could say? Because I mean, art is reaching out across the centuries, in a sense.
Well, I don't really see why just a century, maybe, well, millennia really it doesn't disconnect it. I mean, we read some very old things and are constantly finding them. If we put off being, I don't know, the Greek plays or things earlier than that, looking at the earliest writings within the Bible or other things. The Quran is, of course, much younger. The things that I think would communicate are no different from the things that writing now we're looking at that were written centuries or millennia before communicate to us. I mean, aside from, I don't know, difficult names to pronounce in, say, the Old Testament and the Psalms, or, I mean, those things speak to us now because those things don't change. They don't change a bit. And back to the notion of, well, then is it just no more to that than that they change because we're human and we are born and we so long and we die? That's it. Or does one go at it saying, yes, brother, I understand, I share, and perhaps we'll get to know you.
Well, well, let's end on that note then, because it's a good note to end on. So, Don, thanks for spending a few hours with me.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it, and I'm glad to have discovered Skype. This is my first use ever of it.
Yeah.
And I think it's like a lot of accessibility things now. A modest amount of it with any one individual is probably a good thing.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, the whole point of, I don't know, there's so many things now. For instance, I have a semi-smartphone now. It's not an iPhone.
Yeah.
It's an Android, and a rather primitive Android at that. But the point is, I never do email. I do a minimal amount of texting, absolutely minimal amount, because I just don't like being that darn accessible.
Yeah.
If I'm 1,000 miles from someone, it's, I think, going to be a little more meaningful getting together either through this medium or face to face. If not too much of that happens, and there's a certain wealth that you would then share that otherwise would be sort of dribbled out and not really noticeable.
Yeah. Well, we'll end there.